Some new findings about the world's climate. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the planet experienced its second warmest April on record. And 2017 is the second warmest year to date. Last month also saw record low sea ice in the Arctic and Antarctic.
Maps of the globe could soon need an update. Specifically, this big white region at the southern pole might need some green coloring. Scientists say moss is taking over parts of Antarctica's northern peninsula and could make the continent much greener in the future. A team of UK researchers studied moss core samples from the region. They found the rate of moss growth has steadily accelerated and is now 4 to 5 times higher than it was 50 years ago. A new report published in the journal Current Biology suggests climate change is the driving force behind the growth spurt. The scientists said that as glaciers continue to retreat in Antarctica, the peninsula will get warmer and warmer.
Apparently, even the most advanced apocalypse bunkers aren't safe from climate change. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault was established near the North Pole by the Norwegian government. It aims to preserve the seeds of nearly 1 million different kinds of crops from every country on Earth. The massive vault was buried under the Arctic permafrost to safeguard seeds in case of war or natural disasters. But warming temperatures near the pole melted the ice and flooded the entrance to the vault. The water seeped in, then refroze in the vault's sub-zero temperatures. A Norwegian official said, quote, "It was like a glacier when you went in." Fortunately, the water froze near the entrance and none of the seeds were damaged. But now scientists are concerned about the long-term well-being of the vault, one of humanity's most important backup plans ever.
Some journalists call this
the Noah's Ark of plant diversity, and personally I think that's quite a good name.
Scientists have discovered that the Earth's poles are heating up at a faster rate than the rest of the globe, drastically reducing the amount of ice there. The seed depository is supposed to be totally self-contained and able to function without human help, but now the Norwegian government has to keep an eye on it around the clock. Officials are now trying to divert the meltwater away from the vault and have installed pumps in case any more water seeps in. They said, quote, "We have to find solutions. It is a big responsibility and we take it very seriously. We are doing this for the world."
Stephen Hawking says the human race could risk dying out if we don't colonize a new planet. The renowned scientist was in London previewing a festival. He says overpopulation and climate change are threatening human survival. And according to him, the search for a new planet should start right now. Now, this isn't the first time Hawking has introduced this idea. Earlier this month, he appeared in a BBC documentary and said humans have 100 years to move somewhere else. That's a whole lot less time than what he was predicting in November. Back then, he said we had 1,000 years before we had to jump ship.
I am aware there is a good deal of speculation in the media at the moment regarding my prediction of our time left on this earth. I strongly believe we should start seeking alternative planets for possible habitation. We are running out of space on Earth, and we need to break through the technological limitations preventing us living elsewhere in the universe. I am not alone in this view, and many of my colleagues will make further comments on this at Starmus next month.
152 years and 1 month after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant, a statue of Lee is falling in New Orleans tonight. Omar Villafranca is there.
After 133 years of standing over New Orleans, a statue dedicated to Confederate General Robert E. Lee is the final statue to come down. New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu.
These monuments celebrate a fictional sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement.
The statue of Lee is the first one to come down in broad daylight. Under the cover of darkness, workers removed the statues for Confederate President Jefferson Davis, General P.G.T. Beauregard, and the Liberty Monument because police say there were threats made against the crews.
If we take down these statutes and don't change to become a more open and inclusive society, then all of this would have been in vain.
Protests erupted in New Orleans when the city decided to remove the monuments. Both sides argued over whether these monuments celebrated racism or Southern heritage. Dr. Maria Ortiz with the Southern Christian Leadership Council worked for 44 years to bring the monuments down.
I would point up there and I would say, "You devil, you coming down one day." I thought of the oppression and what my grandmother and they sweat and blood down in this soil.
Businessman Frank Stewart thinks the statues should remain.
I really don't think that anybody should have the privilege of changing history, because history is truth.
No word on where the statues will end up, but Anthony, the mayor, says they cannot be displayed outdoors on public property.
New Orleans recently removed several monuments to the Confederacy. Now Alabama lawmakers are taking steps to prevent that from happening in their state. The Alabama Memorial Preservation Act would, quote, prohibit the relocation, removal, alteration, renaming, or other disturbance of monuments located on public property, which have been in place for 20 or more years. The bill doesn't mention Confederate monuments in particular, but the bill's author made it clear that it was his intention to protect them. State Senator Gerald Allen said, quote, we're seeing a wave of political correctness wipe out monuments to historically significant, if often flawed, people.
ISIL has claimed responsibility for a suicide car bombing near oil fields in southern Basra province. Civilians and members of the Iraqi security forces were among several killed in the attack, and officials say police in the area have been put on maximum alert. When we arrived here, we saw the bus burning. When we entered it, we saw 3 to 4 bodies. They were charred beyond recognition. We couldn't extract them. They were blackened. Meanwhile, Iraqi forces are pushing further into Mosul, ISIL's last major stronghold in the country. They say they're hoping to claim victory within 2 weeks, but the offensive has also created an upsurge in the numbers fleeing the northern city, leaving aid agencies struggling to cope. Up to 200,000 people are expected to leave in the coming days.
The top military officials prosecuting the war against ISIS say new tactics authorized by President Trump to destroy the terrorist group are working. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin has details from the Pentagon.
As the president left for the Middle East, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the State Department Special Envoy, gave an update on the ISIS fight and 2 new tactics that the president has signed off on that they say has accelerated the destruction of ISIS.
No longer will we have slowed decision cycles because Washington, D.C. has to authorize tactical movements on the ground. I have absolute confidence, as does the president, our commander-in-chief, and the commanders on the ground, as he's proven by delegating this authority to me with the authority to further delegate it.
And preventing foreign fighters from leaving Syria and returning home to set up more ISIS cells, ending what had been described in the past as whack-a-mole.
And we estimate that at its peak, foreign fighter flow in Iraq and Syria was 1,500 fighters per month. And today we estimate that those numbers are less than 100 per month.
Mattis and General Joe Dunford both pushed back on news reports that former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn's financial ties to Turkey, taking $500,000 and not registering as a foreign agent, now being investigated by the FBI, interfered with the president's decision to arm the Syrian Kurds, slowing down the effort to retake the ISIS capital, Raqqa.
I can answer that question directly. It did not.
Because we're getting into a more political area where we try to keep our apolitical military complete out, let me just say, only now are we completing the encirclement of Raqqa, and there's been no delay in the effort to do that other than the normal vagaries of the battlefield.
That battlefield got more complicated Thursday when U.S. special operators called in airstrikes on pro-Assad forces that the defense secretary said today included a convoy of Iranian-directed militias who did not heed a U.S. and Russian warning to turn back. Iranian fighters, he said, may have been killed as a result of the U.S. airstrike.
I don't know that we're Iranians on the ground, but by Iranian-directed forces inside an established and agreed-upon deconfliction zone.
On Saturday, former U.S. officials and analysts have said that the re-election of Iranian President Hassan Rouhani is unlikely to change the skepticism within the Trump administration. He is viewed by the administration as the public face of a government opposed to U.S. interests and allies in the Middle East. Analysts said that they want to keep putting pressure on Iran over its weapons programs. Despite the nuclear deal, the United States still considers Iran a state sponsor of terrorism. Rouhani won 57% of the vote in Iran's presidential election on Friday.
Well, congratulatory messages are pouring in for the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani following his re-election. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a message, said that Iran has gained new socio-economic achievements over the past 4 years under Rouhani's leadership, and that ties between the two nations have maintained sound momentum of development. In a telegram to Rouhani, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said his country is ready to continue to further develop cooperation with Iran. Putin also expressed confidence that Moscow and Tehran will continue to work towards maintaining stability in the Middle East and the world as a whole.
Two deals totaling over $150 billion were finalized during President Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, his first foreign trip since taking office. The first is a massive defense agreement, which Trump signed Saturday, that includes $110 billion in fighter jets, tanks, and the THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense anti-missile system. The second is really a collection of smaller deals between Saudi Arabia and US-based defense and energy companies to further develop the kingdom's military, as well as diversify its economy, which is heavily dependent on oil. Those deals total $55 billion.
And as the president travels to the Middle East, a new poll shows a sharp drop in the number of Jewish Israelis who believe the president is pro-Israel. Before he took office, nearly 80% of those surveyed believe President Trump supports Israel. That number has dropped to 56% in the Smith poll taken for the Jerusalem Post. During the time between surveys, the president has welcomed Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas to the White House. He also has suggested Israel stop building in biblical Judea and Samaria.
The U.S. Army is testing out a new camouflage system that it hopes will make tanks more difficult to detect. The U.S. Army's Germany-based 2nd Cavalry Regiment has begun a field evaluation of what's known as the Mobile Camouflage System. MCS uses panels of fabric pre-cut for specific types of armored vehicles, which manufacturer Saab Barracuda said creates a uniform skin. While traditional camouflage may conceal a vehicle from the human eye, the enemy may still be able to spot it easily using radar and thermal imaging. MCS panels also distort the vehicle's shape, making it difficult to identify with radar, as well as reduce its heat signature, making it tougher to detect with thermal infrared sensors. The Army is currently testing MCS-equipped strikers in war games against NATO allies, and will decide whether to roll it out to the rest of the branch later this year.
There's no let-up in the migrant influx to European shores. A reported 5,000 were rescued on Thursday and Friday during multiple operations in the Mediterranean Sea. The Italian and Libyan coast guards coordinated the missions, which took place off the coast of the African nation. One lifeless body was also found. It comes days after the Italian Senate Defense Committee recommended stricter monitoring of NGOs and other humanitarian organizations operating in the Med. The Commission also proposed that Malta and Tunisia, which lie geographically closer to Libya, should do more to help combat the huge numbers of migrants using the country as a launchpad for reaching Europe. According to the International Organization for Migration, over 45,000 migrants have made the treacherous Mediterranean crossing this year so far. 1,332 people died or went missing during the journey.
It was the moment these girls and their families had waited for 3 long years. The reunion was a time for tears and prayers and celebration. The 82 girls were among hundreds who were kidnapped by Boko Haram militants from their hometown of Chibok in 2014. They were released earlier this month.
I feel happy. If I get fed, I will flare up. I will flare up. See this one. See this girl. I will flare up like a fighter. If I get fed, I will flare up. This one, 3 years and 2 months. I will flare with feather. I'm happy. I'm happy.
Joy, joy, joy. I immediately took my daughter in my arms. I'm so thankful.
Hey. Very, very anxiety, very, very serious, joyful.
Though free, the girls will not immediately return to their homes. They'll first remain here in the Nigerian capital to receive medical and psychological counselling organised by the government.
It's been moments of incredible joy and happiness. And although the celebrations are ongoing, some of the parents here said the real celebrations can only start when the remaining 113 girls are back.
Many people in Indonesia are still protesting after the former Christian governor of Jakarta was sentenced to 2 years in prison for blasphemy against Islam. Now, as Lucille Toulousan reports, there's growing concern that Islamic radicals are trying to impose their ideology in the world's largest Muslim nation.
Angry and embittered supporters of Jakarta's Governor Basuki Cahayapurnama, better known as Ahok, gathered in front of this court building demanding the release of the Christian governor.
This banner says, Bebaskan Ahok. It means freedom for Ahok.
Ahok was sentenced to 2 years in prison after being found guilty of blasphemy against the Quran. The charge was based on a re-election campaign speech where he allegedly stated that voters were being deceived by his opponents, who said the Quran prohibits Muslims from having a non-Muslim leader.
Because of this blasphemy clause, maybe you have no willingness to insult the Quran, but just quote the Quran, and then they say you conduct blasphemy.
Ahok, a Christian with ethnic Chinese roots, is a double minority in Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country. Observers say the judges may have been pressured by radical Muslim groups because they ignored the recommendation of the prosecutors to put Ahok under a 2-year probation due to insufficient evidence. Political analyst Bonnie Hargens says Ahok's case is part of a political game plan for the next presidential election. He warns that radical Muslims are using religion to impose their extremist views on the country.
Oil is the platform on which everything was built in Venezuela. The industry has powered the economy, financed governments, and provided the country with the world's cheapest petrol. It will cost you 1 cent to fill up a tank. That's cheaper than water. But now the country's supply may be at risk.
Venezuelans had already been struggling with crippling shortages of food and medicine. And over the past few months, several gas stations ran out of petrol. So people here found themselves queuing for the only thing Venezuela was supposed to have left: fuel.
According to the former Venezuelan deputy energy minister, the country, with the world's largest oil reserves, can no longer satisfy its own demand.
We are importing circa 100,000 barrels per day of motor gasoline. On top of it, it is estimated that we are importing circa 200,000 barrels per day of crude oils, mostly Nigerian and Algerian.
Venezuela's oil has been both a blessing and a curse. The country's economy now depends exclusively on oil. The opposition says the government is to blame for miscalculating demand and counting on an endless rise in oil prices.
Elsewhere, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has delivered his most scathing criticism of U.S. President Donald Trump, telling him to stop intervening in Venezuela's affairs.
De Donald Trump
I reject and condemn Donald Trump's words against the dignity of Venezuela. In Venezuela, there is an honorable government, and here we stand. Get your hands out of here, Trump. Get your pig hands out of here.
Well, Maduro's comments came after the U.S. president expressed dismay about Venezuela's troubles and described the situation in the Latin American country as a disgrace to humanity. Trump says the crisis in Venezuela is possibly the worst of its kind in decades. On Friday, the Trump administration also slapped sanctions against 8 members of Venezuela's Supreme Court, accusing them of damaging the nation's democracy. Maduro told his supporters that Trump should stop his vulgar opinions and should instead think about, quote, his own country and government that are falling apart. Nearly 2 months of political unrest in Venezuela have left at least 46 people dead. The Venezuelan president has long accused his opponents of seeking to stage a U.S.-backed coup.
Shortly after taking office, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte said he was breaking long-standing ties with the U.S. in favor of aligning more closely with China. Now he might be regretting that move. Duterte says China's President Xi Jinping has threatened to go to war with the Philippines over oil in the disputed South China Sea, an increasingly complicated and competitive area. The South China Sea is a valuable shipping lane, and there could be massive oil deposits under the sea floor. It's in between a lot of countries, 6 of which have claimed at least part of the sea. China claimed the biggest chunk of the sea, but an international court ruled that it had no claim to it. But the court has no way to enforce its rulings, so they're only binding if the countries are willing to listen, which China isn't. Despite the spat, both sides seem to want a diplomatic solution, at least for now.
A Cannes cinema in the Palais was evacuated Saturday evening due to a security scare. The city's Debussy cinema was cleared around 7:15 p.m. before the 7:30 p.m. press screening of Redoubtable, the latest film from Michel Hazanaviciu, the director of The Artist. Before the situation was cleared up, staff from inside the theater rushed out and told the press to exit the waiting line. Eyewitnesses said there was a large police and security presence, and people started leaving the cinema. Security officials told the press that it was due to a suspicious bag in the theater. A festival spokeswoman and security personnel at the theater confirmed that security found there was no threat.
Well, chaos erupts at the Barclays Center last night after false reports of gunfire following a rap concert. The NYPD says people leaving a concert by the rapper Future reported hearing gunshots, but officers who responded to the scene say they found no evidence of actual gunfire. Some concert goers say people started running and ducking for cover after hearing loud bangs. Barclays posted this tweet just hours ago, quote, there were no gunshots tonight inside the arena. A loud noise during a loadout caused concern while fans exited the venue. Get home safely, end quote.
According to a law enforcement official, a man who caused a disturbance on a flight between Los Angeles and Honolulu attempted to access the cockpit of the plane. The official spoke to the Associated Press on condition of anonymity. They weren't authorized to discuss an ongoing investigation. The official says the man had tried to breach the cockpit door. He was taken into custody by federal agents when the plane landed. The man was aboard American Airlines Flight 31. According to the official, the man is likely to face federal charges.